Hello, it's Mr. Hall. Welcome to the first of a series of overviews to different periods in medicine through time. So when we think about the Middle Ages, the theme that we really need to focus on is the idea of a lack of progress, that really things didn't get any better. And you're going to need to be able to tell the examiner why that was. So let's have a look and find out. So the first thing to really think about is to get the image of the Middle Ages in your heads, and this is the best image to do so. Sort of ramshackle towns, temporary wooden buildings, stagnant water. You can see there's lots of mud. There have been no concrete, of course, no pavements. You've got animal dung and waste. Butchery. It got so bad that butchery was banned from the cities because of all the offal and all the guts and the animals just being dumped in the river. And really, nothing was done about this, not until the Middle Ages, or rather not until the Black Death. So you get this idea that they only really think about public health when things are really bad. So during epidemic diseases where King Edward ordered this clean-up to try and tackle the problems in London. So it's reactionary is the point, because the king does not see it as his job in any way to keep people healthy. It's not his job at all. There were no real local councils to do that. So theme number one, public health, is really they don't do much. There are occasional things, gongs, farmers, cleanups, but generally speaking, not a lot. Now, if we think more generally about the Middle Ages and just knowing the period, these bits of information on the screen will be helpful. Life expectancy is exceptionally low. That's younger than me, 35. Now, it's not because people get to 35 and drop dead. It's because when women give birth, over half the time, either child or mother dies. We have medicine that effectively is based on the humours and based on purging and the stars, which we'll see in a minute, which doesn't work. Killer diseases, leprosies, plagues, fevers, infections, all those things could knock you down. And just simple things, malnutrition. People didn't eat an awful lot. They didn't have a balanced diet. They produced about a fifth of the food that we do today. And of course, we know they don't understand anything about germs. Now, put all that together, and we get a picture, of a time period where really people's health would not have been very good, and they wouldn't have been strong, and they wouldn't have expected to really live much longer than about 50 on average. So that's that. Now, something that you'll almost definitely need to be able to discuss is the ancient theory of the four humours. Just to remind us that Hippocrates came up with this idea. He is not in the Middle Ages. He was around in about 400 BC. So even if we were to say in the peak of the Middle Ages, it's still almost 1,000 years before. But the point is, the ideas remain. And you won't be asked to know what the four humours were. You'll be asked to tell us why the four humours stuck around so long. So this idea that your body is made up of blood, black bile, yellow bile and phlegm, and that we're ill because they're out of balance, i.e. there's too much of one or not enough, that's what we would call presumed knowledge. The examiner will know that you know that. He or she will be more interested in, okay, well, why? Why does the theory last so long? And the key to that really is the medieval church. That the church really backed this idea, because the other man associated with the four humours was a guy called Galen. And Galen was somebody who had implied, he wasn't a Christian, but his work implied that there was only one God and that God created humans for a purpose. That was enough for the Christian church to sort of give him the green light, and they preached his work. And because of that, you were unable to challenge Galen's idea. So Galen didn't just use the four humours. He actually took it further to a theory of opposites, where if you had something like a cold, you were too wet and too cold, so he would try and warm you up. But generally speaking, he also did anatomy. He told us what we look like in the body. All dissections in churches were done, or rather all dissections done in universities were done through the church, and they would be dissecting for you just to prove that Galen was right. So you get this control of knowledge from the church. If a physician was to train, all he would be able to read would be books produced by church libraries, written by monks, therefore would be the works of Galen. So your access to any other knowledge was just impossible, really. You just didn't have any. You would know, if you were a physician, of which there were only 100 of them anyway, your knowledge would be 4 humours and maybe one other thing that we'll look at next. So the other thing to think about is if your theory of medicine is based on the humours in the Middle Ages, it would also be based on astrology, which means the stars, the configuration of the stars and planets, the patterns of them, when they appear, when they don't. And you can see in the image here Zodiac Man, and the idea here is they would use these charts to try and figure out, to track an illness. This particular one has all the star signs around the outside, and it's telling you where not to bleed, because according to the 4 humours you would bleed to remove excess blood. What this is about where not to bleed at certain times for certain illnesses. So for example, a Pisces, the fish down the bottom there, is associated with the feet, so you would not to bleed the feet around about sort of February time of year. And of course, to us, this is strange, but this is the knowledge they had. Not that they don't have knowledge, it's that their knowledge is different to ours. In the Middle Ages, when there's a problem, they looked up, they looked to the stars and the heavens, and sometimes they got the answers, and sometimes they didn't. All right, so let's look at applying that very, very brief overview to an exam question. These explain why questions come up on quite a lot of the exam papers, in fact 3 of the 4. So it really is worth us thinking about exactly what we have to do. Now, the question stem of explain why. That's really important, because what we're talking about here, every time we see one of these questions, we're being asked to provide reasons for something. Now, in the history of business, we call that causation. Now, what the examiners therefore want to see is that you're not, for this question, explaining what the theory of the 4 humours was. We're explaining why it was believed for so long. So we need to put some reasons forward. And within that, we want to be using causation phrases where we can. We want to be saying things like, this led to, therefore, as a result, without this. We want to try and use as much as that as we can. So when we get this answer, we are given some stimulus points, we're given some bullet point. In this case, this is encouraging. We've got a question about the 4 humours, and we're being asked about Hippocrates and Galen. That would probably be something that we would naturally bring in. We're also being asked about the church. Now, if we don't go beyond those points, if we just stick to probably all that would come into the same point, then we cap ourselves, right? Because the bottom says we have to use information of our own. So no matter how good our answer is, we're not going to get much more than about 7 out of 12. So if we're thinking about this question, we need to start thinking about, okay, what are our 3 points going to be? What are our, and I always think about almost planning and saying, okay, what would my 3 points be? What am I trying to argue? Now you can get to the top of the mark scheme here with 2 points, but I would suggest you have 1, 2, and maybe even if your third is a bit weaker, it's still going to help. And I would be planning out, and my first point, I would be talking about, you know what, the theory of the 4 humours is so important because Hippocrates and Galen were so respected. I'd be talking about how good the idea is, and that might sound odd, but actually a lot of ideas before this, before the 4 humours and after actually, were supernatural. They were to do with gods and spirits and even the stars, and they're things that are really otherworldly, out of our control. At least the 4 humours provided a logical, natural explanation for illness that was better than many competing theories. It explained not just why you were ill, but how you could get better and how you could prevent illness through things like balance, diet, exercise, all things that compute with us today. It was a very, very layered and complex theory. It was like individualized medicine, because even if we had the same illness as somebody else, the bespoke balance of our humours would be different. And that's the point, really. So that's probably a complicated point, but I think one that candidates don't make enough. And I think the standard point, the one that I'd be expecting people to make, is the second one, the idea of the church. And this is where I'd be discussing just how difficult it was to challenge the idea of the 4 humours. I'd be discussing the fact that This was the idea preached by the church, and I would be saying why. I would be talking about Galen and his quasi-Christian beliefs. I would be talking about the church training physicians, and that physicians were unable to read anything except for Galen, and when they weren't allowed to dissect. It was 2 dissections done for them according to Galen. I may even talk about the role of the monasteries and the libraries themselves in controlling knowledge. That leaves me with the third point. Now, we've made the 2 most important points. For me, my third point, and this probably is information of my own, I want to discuss the kind of the fact that the 4 humours was a result of the attitudes of the time. That in the Middle Ages, conservatism, traditionalism were the attitudes of the time, and so it wasn't seen as our place, ordinary people's place, to challenge established medical ideas. So, for example, the ordinary farm labourer wouldn't be able to read anyway. 1 out of 10 people could read in this period, but if he could, who the heck is he to challenge the work of Galen and Hippocrates? And therefore he knew his place, that to challenge the church was to challenge the authority of God, and he could be damned to hell. So I think that's an important point to mention as well. Brilliant. You'll just find on the last slide some information on the mark scheme, but really that is where I'm going to leave you. Thank you very much for listening, and tune in for my next guide to the Renaissance period.